The preamble to the Declaration of Independence states in bold letters and lofty terms the basis on which this nation was founded 250 years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were close to the hearts of those who ratified and signed this declaration in the summer of 1776. They were words close to the hearts of all the people of the original 13 colonies, as the Declaration was read in public squares, in town halls, and in the pulpits of churches across the land. Close to their hearts, because liberty was not what the people had been feeling in those colonies in the previous 13 years, as Great Britain piled tax upon tax upon them following the 7 Years' War. Equality was not what the governed colonists were experiencing at the hands of their government when it declared 3 years later that the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain had full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind, that was the word, to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. So said the Declaratory Act of 1766. And all of these official acts of Parliament were happening without representative voices from those colonies being included or heard. While each of the 13 colonies had assemblies with locally elected representatives in them, those assemblies were not being consulted at all by the British Parliament when it came to these taxes. Indeed, it was as if the colonists were the poor country cousins of Great Britain who needed to be looked after and corrected like children, but not as partners or representatives in governing. So much for equality. Interestingly enough, even before these official acts of Parliament of the 1760s set the matter on a collision course that eventually came to bloodshed, there were voices among the colonists speaking out regarding the relationship of government and those governed. On the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the execution of the tyrant king Charles I, a 29-year-old congregational preacher in Boston by the name of Jonathan Mayhew raised the question of whether St. Paul's admonition that every person be subject to the governing authorities was always something that people should do in every circumstance. Mayhew concluded that Paul's admonition is binding only insofar as government honors its moral and religious obligations to the people it governs. When a government fails to honor that obligation, then the duty of submission is nullified, says Mayhew. Submission to a government, in other words, is not unlimited. He said quite pointedly, rulers have no authority from God to do mischief. Therefore, resistance to corrupt ministers of government and tyrannical rulers is a divine imperative, Mayhew said. The greater sin lies in failing to resist in the face of such corruption. This sermon, titled A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers, really seemed to touch a nerve for the colonists, even in 1750, so long before the Declaration, and so powerfully was the message conveyed. It was published immediately in Boston in 1750, and then in London in 1752, and reprinted numerous times in the colonies as the confrontation with England over taxes heated up in the 1760s. Boston lawyer John Adams, who himself was one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence, remembered how Pastor Mayhew's stirring words were read by everybody. Once the British taxations began, with the Sugar Act in 1764 and then the Stamp Act in 1765, there were many public cries of outrage against colonial liberty. Massachusetts legislator Samuel Adams, a second cousin of John Adams, wrote, "If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having legal representation, where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves?" Patrick Henry, a lawyer and newly seated representative in the Virginia Assembly in 1765, immediately proposed resolves opposing the taxations on the grounds that the colonists had been granted 2 royal charters from King James I, entitling them to all liberties, privileges, and immunities as if they had been abiding and born within the realm of England, and that taxation of the people by themselves or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them is the only security against a burdensome taxation and the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom, he wrote. By the time Parliament enacted the Declaratory Act of 1766, stipulating that absolute sovereignty over the colonies in all cases whatsoever, clergymen all across the colonies were climbing into their pulpits to denounce such British thinking as utterly blasphemous against God, who alone has absolute sovereignty in all cases whatsoever. While preachers preached in pulpits and legislators orated in colonial assemblies, the people themselves took to the streets to make their protests known against forms of government and taxation that were an affront to equality and liberty. Historian Gary Nash writes, "Ferment during the years from 1761 to 1766 changed the dynamics of social and political relations in the colonies and set in motion currents of reformist sentiment with the force of a mountain wind." Effigies of tax governors and other unpopular representatives of the British Crown were burned in public. Homes of other Crown representatives were attacked or burned. Even the famous Boston Tea Party comes out of this period as grassroots colonial revolt over liberties infringed upon. By the time that first shots were fired by the British upon the patriots of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, in April 1775, the frustration of the colonists with British oversight had already reached a tipping point that was felt commonly across the colonies. 1 month before those shots, Patrick Henry stood up in the Virginia Assembly and stated the frustration in no uncertain terms. "Sir, we have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne and have implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and Parliament. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain, after all these things, may we indulge the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we have been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged and to which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our contest shall be obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left to us." That was the context in which those lofty words of the Declaration of Independence were written. It was about liberty. It was about the equality of peoples as created by our Creator God. People with unalienable rights from that same Creator God. Rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so our nation was founded on these principles of equality and liberty. It was about equality and liberty then, and it is still about equality and liberty now. Or it had better be if we are to remain the free people that we are. Scripture has something to say about these things that are important to remember. St. Paul tells us in Galatians 5, verse 1, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." What is it that Christ has set us free from? From sin, and all that divides us from God and from one another. To be yoked with sin is to be yoked with slavery to that same sin. Paul goes on in verse 13 to explain it. "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become enslaved to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another." In other words, the threat to liberty and even equality will always be the sin that fails to love our neighbors as ourselves. Or put another way, the threat to liberty and equality will always be our failure to act for the other and to act instead only for ourselves. John Adams, one of the framers of the Declaration of Independence, understood this principle and worried about it even as the final touches of the Declaration were being made. He wrote down that worry in a letter to his wife the day before the ratification of the Declaration, July 3rd, 1776. In that letter, he said, "It may be the will of heaven that America shall suffer calamities still more wasting and distress, yet more dreadful than the present conflict with Britain. If this is to be the case, it will have this good effect on us, at least. It will inspire us with many virtues which we have not, and correct many errors, follies, and vices which threaten to disturb, dishonor, and destroy us. The furnace of affliction produces refinement in states as well as individuals. And the new governments we are assuming in every part will require a purification from our vices and an augmentation of our virtues, or there will be no blessing. The people will have unbounded power, and the people are extremely addicted to corruption and venality, as are the great. But I must submit all my hopes and fears to an overruling providence in which, unfashionable as the faith may be, I firmly believe." I wonder, are you surprised that John Adams would speak thus of the American people of his day? The corruption and venality he references were clearly spread all around for him to see. But sin is like that, isn't it? And what of our own day? Are the people of today's America any less addicted to corruption and venality, both great and small alike? You only have to turn on the news to get that answer. What a depressing thing to reckon with on this 250th anniversary. but reckon with it we must if we are to continue to uphold the founding principles of equality and liberty. If the sin of corruption and self-interest can undo equality and liberty, and they can, then we must stand up to it, even as Jonathan Mayhew preached it in 1750. Equality and liberty require love and mutual respect of neighbor continually, regardless of one's status or circumstance in life, regardless of one's poverty or wealth, regardless of one's gender or any of those other things that people use to divide one from another, including and maybe even especially political division. It has always been the case that Christians have been called to stand against sin and for love of God and neighbor. Christians have always been called to justice, peace, and mercy, and walking humbly with their God. That is the only way that equality and liberty can be maintained. And it seems Patrick Henry was right. Sometimes you have to fight for it. At that point, I am so grateful for the ballot box. It was for the sake of equality and liberty that the people of this nation were given that privilege and power of the vote. It is through the ballot box that equality and liberty are maintained, because the ballot box can help us to weed out any corruption that we see as a threat to the founding principles of our nation. That duty has been laid in our hands, not just in the hands of the elected officials. We the people is how the preamble to the Constitution states it, not we the government. We have the duty to make sure that equality and liberty are ensured and maintained. Equality and liberty, that's what it was all about in 1776. And that's what it's all about still today. Let us remember these things and think about these things as we give thanks in prayer for the blessing that God has poured down upon us. A lot has happened in these 250 years. A lot is still to come. But include in your prayers the request that God assist you in standing firm on those founding principles of equality and liberty. Because it is when we walk together on this path that we can be sure that we will leave that same legacy of equality and liberty to the generations that follow us. May God grant that it be so. And may God bless us in this our continual endeavor. Amen.